The kitchen renovation involved opening up a narrow galley kitchen into two adjacent rooms and a hallway. So somehow the floors would have to flow as seamlessly as possible all around the first floor of the house. There would no longer be a distinct kitchen floor isolated from the neighboring rooms. This posed one of the biggest design challenges of the renovation. Before the renovation, there was just a narrow kitchen floor covered in terracotta tile. There were only two narrow doorways providing access into the old kitchen. After the renovation, the kitchen floor would transition through wide cased openings. From a front room with antique heart pine floors built in the 1830s to a back room with a painted brick floor built in the 1850s. One option we considered was to use a brick veneer on the new kitchen floor, painting it to look like the original brick floor and back. But it seemed a lot better to find a way to extend the heart pine floors in the front of the house into the renovated kitchen area using reclaimed heart pine boards. Let's look at some of the material used in the renovation of this floor. The original flooring, dating back to the 1830s, is made of this beautiful heart pine material. It's very hard because the grain is so dense, and each board runs the entire width of the house. So quite nice material. And here's a piece you can see that was removed in another area, but it's got that beautiful grain. And if you look at the end grain, you can see just how dense that wood is compared to modern materials. By way of comparison, here's a board you might pick up today. It's southern yellow pine. You can see a lot wider grain, a lot more knots, and to get the width, you have a glue up of multiple smaller pieces instead of a single larger board. Here's a piece of the reclaimed heart pine we were able to get for this project. It's tongue and groove, so the groove along this side, the tongue along the other side. Very, very dense end grain, similar to what you saw in the original material. This is a little bit thinner. It's 3/4 inch is the finished dimension of this wood versus 1 inch in the original house. And it is possible to get this milled as 1 inch. You'd order the 5/4 board, but that seemed unnecessary to incur the extra expense since we were setting the height of the floor joists in this new section and could take into account that slight difference in the thickness of the boards. Before installing the boards, we laid them out in the space to see how they would look. Boards could be swapped around so any flaws would be hidden under cabinets and the most interesting grain patterns left visible. Also note that tongue and groove joinery is typically offset from the center, so it's important to line up all the boards the same way. I recommend the thicker side up so that the floor could be sanded more times before hitting the tongue and groove. There are 3 transition points for this floor. The first is a flush transition from the original wide pine flooring at the front of the house to the new heart pine floor in the kitchen. The second is a flush transition from the new heart pine floor in the kitchen to the original brick floor in the back of the house. And then the third is a transition across a threshold from the new heart pine floor into the hallway, where the existing floor is about 3/4 of an inch lower than the new floor in the kitchen. Since that flush transition of the old to the new floorboards was the most critical, it made sense to start there and then work back through the kitchen over to the brick floor. There was no groove in the existing floorboard, so I used a few dowels to join the new floorboard to the old flooring. This seemed a lot less risky than cutting a new groove into the existing floorboard with a slot cutter. For the flush transition, there was a little bit of cleanup to bring the old and the new boards into alignment, mainly removing some of the old floor surface that was exposed when the doorway was expanded into a wider cased opening. With the first floorboard in place, I could begin laying down the rest of the floor. I marked reference lines on the subflooring to help ensure that each new board installed remained parallel with the existing flooring. Any deviation from parallel would start to be amplified as more boards were put down, potentially making a mess of the transition to the brick floor across the room. So having these reference lines was critical for keeping the installation on track. This new flooring was attached with cleats using a pneumatic nail gun. So the cleats dropped into the lower part of the groove, and then the tongue for the next piece butted up. Now you'll notice that when you just place these boards next to each other, there's no gap whatsoever. They fit very cleanly, and it's important when you do the installation to have a small spacer so that the finished result looks like the original flooring. So you can see that was done here throughout the kitchen. Otherwise, you have a look that's more like a bowling alley where these are sealed up, and that's quite nice, but doesn't quite replicate what you find over in the original part of the house here. These gaps are even wider, and who knows, maybe in time these will open up and darken some more, but it's certainly enough visually for each of the boards to stand out in the same way that the original material does. Making the kitchen floor level with the front room of the house left it a little bit higher than the existing flooring in the hallway. So I built a threshold to transition from the new kitchen floor down into the hallway through the cased opening. This threshold was made with a piece of tongue and groove board. And so with the tongue on the threshold, and you can see it's offset slightly. There's more material above the tongue and less below. And in order for that to butt up against these floorboards, using a slot cutting bit on the router, a groove was made on each of the boards emerging through the cased opening that resembles this. This was just a test piece that I used to confirm the operation of that slot cutting bit, and that worked very nicely to apply a groove perpendicular to the groove of the board that would accept this tongue from the board used to make up the threshold. The last floorboard, where it meets the brick, is attached with trim head screws, since there's no way to get a cleat toenailed into the groove. Also note that this board was made 1 inch wider in order to transition over to the brick. An additional strip was just glued up in advance. Before this floor renovation, there was terracotta tile laid over several generations of subfloor. It was squeaky and seemed uneven. We tore this all up and went right back down to the original floor joists. The original floor joists in the crawl space underneath the kitchen have now been supported with steel beams. They're resting on block piers. We also added a block wall at the end of the crawl space, and this sits directly underneath the slab that holds the brick in the back of the house. We wanted this additional level of support because in the past, this area was covered with cabinetry and the bar top, but has now become a very high traffic area through the home. A new subfloor was created with 3/4 inch tongue and groove plywood attached to the floor joists with construction adhesive and screws. For finishing this floor, I selected the Czar oil-based self-leveling polyurethane that I've used on other projects. It's a great choice for a kitchen floor that sees very heavy use. One mistake I made was staining the new floor to try to match the original floor more precisely. The stain ended up making it a lot harder to see the grain of the reclaimed heart pine, which was very disappointing. Ultimately, I decided to sand off the stain and finish the bare wood with polyurethane, and that turned out a lot better. This extra sanding added quite a few hours of additional work, but it was something I'm glad I did. It worked fine using a random orbit sander with a dust attachment and the mesh sanding pads that don't tend to bind up as quickly as traditional pads. I'm glad I took the time to do this. I think it would have really bothered me looking at a muddy appearance to the floor instead of what we ultimately achieved here. Thanks for watching. There is a lot more about this kitchen renovation in a series of related videos that you'll find on this YouTube channel. We could not be happier with this floor or how much it adds to the kitchen and the flow of the entire house.